March 1945 carried the scent of ending, wet earth, diesel exhaust, and the peculiar silence that comes when an enemy no longer looks invincible. Winston Churchill was moving toward the Rhine, that old European boundary now swollen with meaning. Along its western bank, British headquarters had prepared not only bridging gear and artillery tables, but a scene: cameras, correspondence, and carefully positioned witnesses. A river crossing could be an operation. It could also be a message, delivered in steel and film, that Britain still stood at the front of history. In a folder close at hand lay the draft communiqué, words polished like brass. It was meant to crown Bernard Montgomery's assault as the decisive, disciplined breach into Germany. The phrasing had been chosen to travel home cleanly: a great set piece, a deliberate blow, a British-led passage into the enemy's last interior space. By March 1945, armies were measured not only in divisions and tonnage, but in what their victories looked like when translated into headlines. Churchill, veteran of a lifetime of crises, treated language as a form of ammunition. In the carriage and the staff car, he turned sentences over in his mind the way others checked fuses and ranging data. A cigar sat between his fingers, its glow steady in the grey light. He adjusted it almost absent-mindedly, rehearsing a clause, an adjective, the order of emphasis, because he understood something soldiers sometimes forgot. A nation fights on belief as much as on fuel. Then the message arrived. It was short. It was factual. It had none of the ceremony men prepare when they think history will wait for them. Patton's Third Army, driving with its usual impatience, had already forced a crossing of the Rhine farther south, at Oppenheim, and established a bridgehead. The river that was supposed to be Britain's stage had been stepped onto by an American before the curtain rose. Montgomery read the dispatch without expression. The stillness in his face was not calm. It was discipline used as armor. He had built an operation that depended on order, timelines, coordination, an assault designed to be seen and understood. And now a rival method had struck first. Improvisation, speed, and the blunt insistence that success should be announced the moment it existed. Humiliation did not need to be spoken aloud. In the rooms where staff maps lay open, it could be felt like a pressure change. Churchill saw the problem immediately, and it was not tactical. German resistance along the Rhine was already bending under the weight of Allied material. Another bridgehead would only hasten collapse. But inside the alliance, this was a detonation of prestige. Britain needed symbols to maintain influence. America needed recognition commensurate with its mass and momentum. And the enemy, still fighting, still hoping for cracks, needed only discord to buy time. For a moment, Churchill did not speak. The silence was heavy, the kind that comes before a decision that will ripple beyond the riverbank. Somewhere ahead, the cameras waited for the planned words. Somewhere behind, a new headline was already forming. And in that pause, cigar smoke, damp air, paper in hand, Churchill faced a question that would define the tone of victory itself. Would this crossing become a shared triumph, or the opening shot of a rivalry fought in daylight? The Rhine at night did not look like a boundary on a map. It looked like a moving sheet of black glass, disturbed by cold wind and the low, deliberate sounds of men trying not to be heard. In late March 1945, Patton's Third Army reached it with the impatience that had become its signature. Assault boats slid into the water under a dim sky, oars biting silently, engines held back until the last possible moment. On the far bank, German sentries watched the wrong stretches of river, still trained by months of expectation to fear the grand, obvious blow, not the quick hand in the dark. The first Americans across did not arrive to a cinematic thunderclap. They arrived to confusion, scattered fire, hurried flares, shouted commands that came a second too late. A bridgehead is not built in a single act. It is carved, metre by metre, by men who understand that the first minutes decide the entire story. Patton's units moved with that understanding. Once footholds were secured, engineers followed with the tools of permanence: pontoons, cables, bridging equipment, turning a daring crossing into an irreversible fact. By the time higher headquarters fully grasped what had happened, the river was no longer a barrier. It was a line already behind them. To Americans, it felt like the purest form of victory. Initiative rewarded, tempo maintained, the enemy denied the chance to recover. The crossing did not merely take ground, it shortened time. In a war of exhaustion, time had become the most expensive commodity on the continent. Patton had always treated it that way, something to be seized, not requested. His soldiers had learned the same rhythm: move, secure, move again, before the German defense could become coherent. But what looked like clean success from one side of the alliance looked like theft from the other. Montgomery's crossing had been prepared like a set piece, artillery registered, schedules drafted, press arrangements laid down with the certainty of a man who believed victory should arrive in orderly columns. Patton's early passage did not damage Montgomery's ability to cross the Rhine. It damaged something more fragile, the sense that Britain still controlled the narrative of the Western Front. A meticulously planned moment had been punctured by a rival's momentum. Somewhere in a British headquarters tent, a staff officer stared at the press plan as if it were a map suddenly made irrelevant. The list of correspondence, the timing of briefings, the wording drafted for release, everything that had been arranged to shape public understanding now felt unstable. He realized, perhaps with a kind of professional dread, that headlines could injure like shrapnel, not by killing bodies, but by tearing at confidence, status, and the delicate pride that held coalitions together. And here the first late-war irony revealed itself. The enemy was collapsing. The Reich was breaking apart in provinces and pockets, not in a single clean surrender. Yet as the end approached, the commanders who had survived years of grinding battle began fighting for something else, the story of the war. History, like territory, was being claimed, and the closer victory came, the more fiercely men competed to be remembered as its architect. Churchill could feel the dilemma tightening like wire. Britain needed symbols to sustain morale and political weight. America needed recognition equal to its overwhelming contribution, and Germany, desperate, cornered, needed only discord between allies to buy days, even hours. The crossing itself was a triumph, but the triumph had arrived in a way that threatened unity. The Rhine was being crossed in boats and bridges, but so was a quieter line, the one that separated cooperation from rivalry. And as the news spread through headquarters and newspapers alike, one question began forming beneath the celebration. If a victory could feel like a theft, what would the alliance do when pride demanded repayment? Montgomery's anger did not arrive in raised voice or theatrical gesture. It arrived the way his authority usually arrived, through paper, procedure, and the cold grammar of order. In the hours after Patton's crossing became public, British headquarters began producing memoranda and objections with the precision of a staff drill. The complaint was framed not as wounded pride, but as principle. An alliance could not function if commanders acted independently, if operations and announcements were not centrally controlled. In Montgomery's world, war was a system. Systems did not tolerate freelancing. He chose his language carefully, because language was a weapon in a coalition. Patton was described as undisciplined, too fast, too public, too hungry for headlines. The criticism was not simply about boats on the Rhine, it was about conduct, and therefore legitimacy. If Patton could be made to look reckless, then his success could be recategorized as a problem rather than an achievement. This was an old maneuver in armies. When you cannot undo a fact, you attack the manner in which it was achieved. Across the river, inside Patton's own headquarters, the mood shifted almost immediately. Victory should have felt clean, but in a coalition, victory could acquire a second shadow. Staff officers, men who had learned Patton's rhythms and his tempers, sensed the air cooling. They spoke more softly around radios, as if volume itself could summon reprisal. Messages that normally would have been brisk became cautious. The maps still showed arrows moving east, but the room felt as though another front had opened, one made of protocol and resentment. The accusation sharpened as it travelled. Patton, they said, had not merely crossed early. He had insisted the world be told immediately. In Montgomery's view, that insistence was not an afterthought. It was the offence. Announcements were meant to follow a script, to preserve unity and sequence. Patton had treated publicity as part of the operation, an extension of momentum. He understood that headlines could secure fuel and priority, that the perception of unstoppable advance could unbalance an enemy already cracking. But in doing so, he had stepped directly on the stage Montgomery had built. Here the second irony emerged, colder than the first. Coalition war demands unity. Yet unity is rarely a matter of shared feeling. It is a matter of controlled sacrifice. Someone must accept being upstaged. Someone must swallow the private bitterness that comes when another man's victory becomes the public symbol. The Rhine did not simply divide Germany from the West. It exposed what the alliance tried not to admit, that even righteous causes are carried forward by human pride. Montgomery wanted consequences, not necessarily out of malice, but out of a belief that without discipline, the machine would shake itself apart. If Patton could be checked, reprimanded, restrained, perhaps even removed, then order could be reasserted. But the alliance faced consequences of its own if Patton became a scapegoat for winning. Punishing success would not look like discipline to Washington. It would look like jealousy dressed as principle. And so the quarrel widened beyond the riverbanks. This was no longer about who crossed first. It was about what kind of war the Allies believed they were fighting, one governed by careful choreography or one driven by relentless speed. To understand why this demand carried such force, we have to pivot backward, because the clash at the Rhine was only the latest chapter in a tension forged long before the boats touched water. Bernard Law Montgomery did not think like the cavalrymen of earlier wars. He thought like an engineer tasked with preventing catastrophe. To him, battle was not an arena for inspired risk. It was a problem set in mud and blood, solvable through preparation. He wanted the conditions arranged before the first shot, the variables narrowed before the first man moved. Where other commanders spoke of boldness, Montgomery spoke of certainty. He did not chase chaos. He tried to starve it. That belief had been shaped by the long arithmetic of the war itself, by Britain's thin manpower, by the memory of 1914 to 18, by the knowledge that a single reckless operation could destroy what the nation could not easily replace. Montgomery's doctrine was simple and hard: concentrate overwhelming force, strike where success is most probable, and reduce the enemy's choices until his resistance becomes a mechanical reaction rather than a creative act. In that system, surprise mattered, but reliability mattered more. The point was not to be spectacular. The point was to be inevitable. He also understood morale as something that could be manufactured. An army, like a country, fights best when it believes the future is being managed by competent hands. So Montgomery performed certainty. He did not merely plan, he displayed planning as proof of leadership. His headquarters ran on timetables and rehearsals. His staff work was neat, his intentions clearly stated, his objectives numbered and aligned. If war had to be endured, then it should be endured under a method that promised order. In his briefings, officers would later recall a particular atmosphere, less like conversation, more like instruction. Montgomery spoke with the confidence of a man delivering a sermon, and his maps became scripture. The timetable was not just a schedule, it was a moral law. Units were expected to fit into it the way parts fit into a machine. Doubt, improvisation, and personal drama were treated as impurities. In Montgomery's vision, a commander did not ride the tide of battle. He engineered the tide. This is why the Rhine mattered so deeply to him. By 1945, it was not only the last great river barrier before Germany's interior, it was a stage large enough to carry national meaning. Britain had been fighting since 1939, bleeding in the early years when America was still distant. Now, as the end approached and American weight dominated the Western Front, Montgomery needed a moment that proved Britain still commanded history, not merely participated in it. A controlled crossing, executed under his banner and captured by cameras, could be turned into political currency. Evidence of British competence, British leadership, British relevance. Improvisation threatened all of that, not because improvisation was always wrong, but because improvisation could fail in public. And Montgomery feared public failure more than private criticism. He knew the home front was tired, the government brittle, the empire under strain. Embarrassment on the Rhine would not just bruise a general's reputation, it could become another crack in Britain's confidence at the very moment post-war leverage was being negotiated in advance. When a nation is exhausted, symbols become load-bearing, yet here the moral tension begins to tighten. Control can win battles. It can reduce casualties, preserve strength, and make victory repeatable. But control, once it becomes doctrine, can also demand ownership. It can start to treat success as something that must arrive in a specific shape, under a specific name, at a specific hour, because otherwise it does not feel like success at all. In that way, competence can slide toward entitlement without the man noticing the change. And that is why Patton's crossing was not merely inconvenient. It was an affront to Montgomery's worldview. Patton did not believe victory had to look controlled. Patton believed victory had to move. And so we cut now to the man Montgomery could not tolerate, not because he was incompetent, but because he represented the one force Montgomery could never fully engineer, momentum. George S. Patton belonged to a different faith than Montgomery. Where Montgomery sought certainty, Patton worshipped time. In his mind, hesitation was not caution, it was sin. Every pause gave the enemy a chance to breathe, to regroup, to harden a line that had been soft a day before. He spoke about war the way some men speak about weather, something that could turn against you without warning if you allowed it to settle. So he did not allow it to settle. He pushed it forward. Patton's doctrine was blunt, and in its way it was moral. He believed aggressive movement saved lives, not through gentleness, but through compression. Shorten the war, and you shorten the duration of suffering. Break the enemy's ability to reorganize, and you break the cycle that produces new casualties tomorrow. To Patton, speed was not merely tactical advantage. It was mercy expressed as momentum. He did not romanticize death, but he did romanticize decision. Better a hard push today than a slow grind for weeks. The arithmetic of casualties, he believed, favored the commander who refused to let Germany recover its balance. At dawn, when the maps were still damp from the night air and the staff officer's eyes were raw with fatigue, Patton could be found leaning over his charts as if he could physically pull the front line east with his hands. He talked in miles per day, in hours gained, in bridges seized before the enemy understood they mattered. It was a peculiar language, half logistics, half prophecy. He spoke as though the future could be ordered forward if the will behind it was fierce enough. And for months, in France and into Germany, the results had seemed to validate his faith. Patton also understood something Montgomery disliked admitting. War was fought in newspapers as well as on rivers. He grasped the power of headlines the way he grasped the importance of fuel dumps. The public story of an advance could become a weapon, one that loosened supply priorities, pressured higher command, and convinced nervous allies that the American drive was unstoppable. It could also frighten the enemy, because fear is not only created by shells, it is created by the belief that shells will not stop. So Patton cultivated the image of relentless motion, knowing it could win him gasoline today and surrender tomorrow. But his gift carried its own poison. Patton's flaw was inseparable from his strength. He could confuse victory with permission. Each successful gamble tempted him to believe that the next gamble was already justified. The faster he moved, the more he trusted speed itself as proof of correctness. That trust made him brilliant in the moments when the enemy was disoriented. It also made him dangerous in the moments when coordination mattered more than audacity. Patton's impatience was not just temperament, it was ideology. And ideology, once proven by success, can become immune to restraint. The engine beneath it all was personal, almost intimate. Patton needed motion not only for strategy, but for identity. He had built himself as a commander in perpetual advance, a man whose purpose was action and whose meaning was measured in distance gained. Stillness threatened him. Delays felt like suffocation. In his mind, the war could not be allowed to become a committee meeting. It had to remain a charge. And if the world applauded the charge, all the better. Applause was evidence that motion mattered. This is why the Rhine crossing was more than a tactical decision. It was Patton proving again that momentum could outpace choreography. But a coalition cannot run on one man's religion, no matter how effective it seems. Someone had to translate these opposites, Montgomery's control and Patton's velocity, into a single Allied war effort. And that translator, watching both men with the eye of a statesman, was Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill had never mistaken war for a purely military contest. Long before the first Allied soldier set foot in Normandy, he had understood that modern war is also a contest of belief. Armies require fuel, ammunition, and replacements, but nations require meaning. Morale must be fed like divisions in the field, steadily, deliberately, and with an awareness that hunger returns quickly. Churchill had lived through the slow corrosion of public will in 1914-18, and he had watched democracies waver in the 1930s when conviction thinned. By 1945, he was fighting Germany with tanks and bombers, but he was also fighting exhaustion, doubt, and the quiet fear that Britain might emerge victorious, yet diminished. That is why the Rhine crossing mattered to him in a way that went beyond operational charts. It had been designed as Britain's cinematic proof of continuing relevance, an image of disciplined power at the moment the war's ending began to come into view. The river itself was symbolic, ancient, stubborn, and deeply European, a barrier that had defined borders and ambitions for centuries. To cross it under a British banner, with cameras watching, was to say to the world, especially to allies and future negotiators, that Britain remained more than a brave participant. It remained a shaper of outcomes. Churchill's mind moved naturally toward words, because he knew words are how events are carried home. In a quiet micro-moment, almost trivial compared to the scale of the armies, he could be seen adjusting a draft statement, correcting a single adjective, shifting a phrase, tightening a sentence. It looked like pedantry. It was not. He understood that adjectives can move public will. Bold and steady do not mean the same thing. Decisive and successful do not land with equal weight. In a country that had rationed for years, buried sons, and stared into the possibility of decline, language was not decoration. It was reinforcement. Yet Churchill also understood the physics of the alliance, and physics does not bend to pride. American power had become the war's mass, its industrial volume, its manpower depth, its logistical reach. That mass carried the Western Front forward with a momentum Britain could not replicate alone. To insult it, to punish it, to treat American success as an inconvenience was to risk destabilizing the very force that was crushing Germany. Coalitions are not sustained by affection. They are sustained by carefully managed respect. And Churchill, for all his love of Britain's grandeur, knew that respect had to flow in both directions. He also possessed an instinctive admiration for boldness, even when boldness arrived wrapped in roughness. He could be irritated by American exuberance, and he could be wounded by being outshone. But he recognized in Patton's kind of aggression a brutally effective instrument. Boldness was how Germany was being broken now, not with cautious diplomacy, but with relentless pressure, with crossings seized before the enemy could restore coherence, with the refusal to let the retreat become orderly. Churchill had spent years urging attack when others counselled delay. He could hardly condemn the very trait he had demanded from his own commanders, and so the central contradiction formed around him like tightening wire. Churchill had to protect British pride without punishing American success. He had to preserve the idea of Britain as a leading power while acknowledging a reality that could not be argued away. The United States now dominated the weight of the coalition. If he leaned too far toward Montgomery's grievance, he risked provoking Washington and slowing the war's final acceleration. If he leaned too far toward Patton's triumph, he risked humiliating Britain at the very moment it needed symbols to stand upright in the post-war world. It was not an easy contradiction, and it could not be solved with a speech alone. Because by late March 1945, the battlefield was no longer only rivers and bridges. It was microphones and reputations, communiques and camera lenses, an invisible front where men fought over what victory would mean when the shooting stopped. And as Churchill moved toward the Rhine, he could already feel that this next struggle would not be settled by artillery, but by restraint. The Rhine was more than water. It was geography armed with memory. For centuries it had been a border in the European imagination, sometimes a shield, sometimes a prize, always a line that attracted ambition. In March 1945 it became the last great natural barrier before Germany's industrial heartland, a river that could slow tanks, delay supply columns, and force an attacker to expose himself at the worst possible moment. Halfway across, crowded into boats and pontoons, with no cover but smoke and prayer. The Germans knew what it meant too. They had been driven back from France, out of Belgium, across the West Wall, and now they were collapsing toward the interior. If the Rhine could be held even briefly, it might buy time for a political miracle that would never come. In war, the final barriers are rarely just tactical. They are psychological. Montgomery treated the river accordingly. His plan for crossing was colossal, an operation designed to make the Rhine stop being a barrier through the sheer weight of Allied capability. It was not one of Patton's quick thrusts. It was a carefully engineered assault, built to overwhelm the defenders' senses and decision-making. Massed artillery would pound the far bank. Smoke generators would turn the river into a grey curtain. Engineers would push bridging equipment forward on a schedule that left little room for improvisation. Airborne forces, parachute and glider troops, were meant to drop beyond the river to seize key roads and disrupt German reaction. It was war staged as inevitability. Every component placed to reduce uncertainty, every step timed so that success looked like the natural result of order. In the weeks leading up to it, the Rhine became a workshop. British and Canadian engineers moved along the banks with measuring tools and notebooks, their work quiet but decisive. They calculated current speed and load-bearing limits, tested cable strength, assessed where pontoons could be anchored without being torn downstream. This was the micro-moment where modern armies reveal themselves. Victory built from mathematics. A bridge is not a symbol until it holds. A river crossing is not a story until the first truck rolls across and keeps rolling. The engineers understood that the real enemy was not only German fire, but the river itself, cold, heavy, indifferent. Around them, the machinery of a set piece assembled. Artillery units registered targets. Smoke units rehearsed their output and placement. Staff officers refined timetables until the columns on paper looked as disciplined as the parade ground image Britain still wanted to project. The riverbank filled with the objects of preparation: bridging bays, assault boats, stacks of Bailey Bridge components, coils of rope and cable, vehicles lined up in the order they would be needed. It was planning as spectacle, and spectacle as reassurance. If the Rhine was a fortress, Montgomery intended to take it with a siege. Patton watched these preparations and saw something else. Not incompetence. He respected competence when it produced results, but an opportunity created by predictability. He understood the enemy's mind as well as Montgomery did, and perhaps more cynically. If the Germans were watching this build-up, they would expect the hammer. They would orient their attention toward the obvious blow, Montgomery's grand assault, announced in advance by the very scale of its preparation. Patton's instinct was to slip in where attention had been pulled away. Where the enemy expected thunder, he would bring a knife, sharp, quiet, and already inside before anyone could shout a warning. This was not merely rivalry, it was the logic of late-war combat. By 1945, surprise was scarce. The Allied armies were huge. Their movements were difficult to conceal. German reconnaissance, though weakened, still observed patterns. The age of dramatic operational surprises was fading, replaced by a brutal contest of tempo and exploitation. In that environment, the First Army across a major barrier gained more than a bridgehead. It gained freedom of movement, while the enemy still struggled to assemble a coherent response. And just as importantly, it gained narrative dominance. The first crossing becomes the remembered crossing. The first headline becomes the historical photograph. That truth haunted the riverbanks. It meant that Montgomery's meticulous set-piece was not only an operation, it was a contest for authorship. If his crossing happened second, even if it was larger, even if it was more sophisticated, it would still be framed as following the American lead. And Britain, exhausted and sensitive to decline, could not easily accept being cast in a supporting role at the moment the final act began. So the Rhine held two fortresses at once, the German defence line on the far bank and the Allied pride line behind it. Churchill approached the scene expecting a set-piece worthy of the cameras that waited. He expected a demonstration of British method, of discipline translated into triumph. But battlefields have a habit of delivering improvisation even when plans are beautiful. The Rhine did not care about speeches, and neither did Patton. Somewhere south, an American crossing was already proving that the river could be breached without waiting for the grand choreography. And now, with the water moving darkly beneath the smoke and the engineers' calculations, two Allied philosophies converged on the same river, one seeking control, the other seeking speed. The enemy on the far bank was still dangerous. But the more immediate danger Churchill could sense was that the Allies might begin to treat each other as obstacles on the road to victory. By the spring of 1945, the Western Front had begun to resemble a moving curtain call. The German army was breaking, but it was breaking unevenly. One town surrendering, another resisting, pockets collapsing while others fought on out of habit. In that atmosphere, correspondents travelled almost as faithfully as fuel convoys. Cameras appeared wherever a moment could be promised. Newsreel men adjusted tripods beside mud-splattered staff cars. Reporters waited for briefings the way infantry waited for rations. The war was still lethal, still real, but its ending had created a new hunger, the hunger to define what it meant. Montgomery understood that hunger, and he planned for it as meticulously as he planned for artillery fire. His Rhine crossing was being shaped into a national performance. Britain's disciplined strength made visible at the precise hour when victory began to feel inevitable. This was not vanity alone. Britain had lived for years under strain that Americans did not fully share. Rationing, bombardment, shipping losses, the constant knowledge that the country's margin for error was thin. By 1945, Britain needed not only to win, but to be seen winning in a way that could sustain post-war authority. A controlled assault, executed under British command and captured for the world, could function like a political bridge as important as any pontoon bridge over the river. And so the machinery of theatre grew alongside the machinery of war. Press officers coordinated movement, liaison staff managed access, timetables were arranged so that the story would unfold cleanly, first the build-up, then the assault, then the breakthrough. Even language was prepared in advance. In one small office, a press officer rehearsed wording for the releases with the seriousness of a man handling explosives. First assault crossing. Main effort. Decisive blow. The phrases were chosen not merely to describe events, but to preempt interpretation, because in coalition war, interpretation is a battlefield. But theatre is fragile. It depends on sequence, it depends on timing, and timing in war belongs to whoever takes it. Patton understood that instinctively. He had never been interested in playing the supporting role in another man's production, particularly when his own soldiers were doing the bleeding and the moving. To Patton, the Rhine was not a stage for ceremony. It was a door to be kicked open before the enemy could wedge it shut again. He did not deny the value of morale, but he believed morale was born from motion, not from speeches. And he knew that if he crossed first and made it known, he would not just gain ground, he would gain priority. Supplies follow victory, attention follows headlines. In a war driven by logistics, attention could become a form of fuel. This is where the late war rivalry revealed its deeper shape. It was not only ego, it was a contest for post-war influence and remembered greatness. As victory approached, commanders began thinking in two timeframes at once: the next 72 hours of operations and the next 20 years of memory. The war would end, and then politics would begin in earnest, over borders, rebuilding, spheres of influence, the future balance between Britain and the United States. In that future, reputations would matter. The story of who led would matter. The film reels and newspaper banners would become evidence presented to the public and to history alike. Churchill saw this danger with a clarity sharpened by a lifetime in politics. He understood that if the British public began to believe Britain was slow or merely following America's lead, Britain's leverage would shrink. Nations do not negotiate from private knowledge. They negotiate from perceived strength. And perception, in 1945, was being manufactured daily by reporters and communiques. Churchill had spent years building and protecting the image of Britain as steadfast and central. Now, at the Rhine, that image could be altered by a single announcement, by the order in which the world heard the news. Yet he also understood the other half of the physics. America's contribution was immense and visible, the weight of men, vehicles, aircraft and supplies that moved the front forward like a tide. If Britain appeared to resent American success, the alliance itself could sour at the moment it needed unity most. Germany still had weapons. German armies still fought. A crack in Allied confidence was not a matter of pride alone. It could cost lives, slow the advance, and extend the war's final violence. The most ominous truth was that all of this could happen without a single shot fired between allies. It could happen through timing and language, through which headquarters released a communique first, through whose photographers captured the first bridge, through a caption beneath a photograph. In wartime, the line between operational reality and public narrative is thin. By 1945, it was almost transparent. Men who had survived artillery barrages now found themselves wounded by headlines. And on the Rhine's western bank, as cameras waited and scripts were drafted, the war's theatre became its own kind of battlefield. Someone, somewhere, was about to win the headline before the grand assault even began. The question was no longer whether the Allies could cross the river. They could, and they would. The question was, what would happen to the alliance when one crossing arrived early, and the world was told at once? The Rhine at night was a different creature than the Rhine by day. In daylight it could be studied, measured for current, scanned for crossings, plotted on maps with confidence. At night it became uncertainty made visible, a moving darkness, cold and heavy, reflecting no promise except that it would punish hesitation. On the western bank near Oppenheim, American assault troops waited in the kind of silence that is not calm, but controlled. Boots sunk into damp ground, hands testing straps and weapons, eyes fixed on the far bank where shadows could hide anything. The air carried the smell of river mud and engine oil. Somewhere behind them, trucks and bridging equipment waited like restrained animals. The crossing began with small boats, pushed into the water with a careful economy of sound. Oars dipped and lifted, the motion deliberate, the men low in the hulls. A river assault is not heroic in the cinematic sense. It is a geometry of vulnerability. There is no room to take cover. There is only forward movement and the hope that the first minutes pass without the enemy understanding what is happening. On the far side, German positions were present but misaligned, watching sectors shaped by expectation, prepared for the grand assault farther north, not for a sudden cut here in the darkness. When shots did come, they came late and unevenly, more like surprise than defense. The first Americans on the eastern bank did what river assaulters always do. They made the crossing true by making it irreversible. They pushed inland quickly, seizing ground not for glory but for space. Space to absorb counterfire, space for engineers to work, space for the second wave to land without being slaughtered on the bank. In the dark, shapes became orders. A flare arced upward and briefly revealed the river's surface, then died. The bridgehead held not because the Germans were absent, but because the Americans moved as though time itself were the enemy. In a matter of hours, the initial foothold became a working front, and once that happened, the rest followed with the logic of a chain reaction. Engineers came next, men whose names would never headline, but whose calculations would decide whether Patton's audacity became permanent. Pontoon sections were dragged forward, cables were secured. Under sporadic fire and constant pressure, the temporary became functional. A bridge is not built in a single dramatic act. It is assembled piece by piece, each piece carrying the weight of what comes after. When the first vehicles began to cross, the sound changed. The dull clatter of metal plates, the growl of engines, the unmistakable signal that an army was turning a river into a road. Speed did what it always did for Patton. It multiplied itself. Each hour gained made the next hour easier to seize. And in the midst of it, Patton did what made allies uneasy and enemies nervous. He demanded that the world be told, immediately. It was a small moment in the midst of an enormous operation, but it carried the weight of intention. Patton's voice, triumphant and insistent, cut through the night's exhaustion. This was not a private victory to be tidied up before announcement. This was a fact to be declared at once, because facts declared early become the framework through which everything else is understood. He wanted the message out not after the bridge was perfected, not after the situation was comfortable, but while the crossing was still fresh and undeniable. In Patton's mind, delay was surrender, not to the Germans but to politics. Higher headquarters heard him, and the news moved quickly, through Bradley's staff channels, through communique drafts, through telephones and teletype. When it reached the press, it did not arrive like a cautious report. It arrived like a headline. Bradley's headquarters released the information with timing that felt, to British eyes, almost deliberate, like a pin pushed carefully into Montgomery's balloon just before it could rise. Whether it was calculated or merely efficient mattered less than how it looked. In coalition war, perception often becomes reality, because perception shapes trust. The revelation, bitter and unavoidable, was that even success could be used as a weapon, if not against the enemy, then against an ally's pride. Patton's crossing did not reduce Montgomery's ability to cross the Rhine. It reduced the uniqueness of Montgomery's moment. It changed the story before the story could be told the way Britain had planned. It made Britain's grand set-piece feel, in the public mind, like a follow-on action rather than the decisive breach. And in the politics of 1945, follow-on actions were not what Britain needed to be remembered for. Montgomery read the headlines and heard something worse than insult. He heard irrelevance. Not as a personal injury alone, but as a national risk, the fear that Britain's sacrifices would be translated into a secondary role in the final narrative. In his discipline, he did not erupt. He narrowed his complaint into procedure and principle. But beneath the controlled language was a hard truth. In the war's final act, being second could feel like being erased. And then the fuse reached Churchill. It reached him not as a question of bridges or bridgeheads, but as a question of what the alliance would become in victory's shadow. Patton had crossed, and Montgomery had been upstaged. And now Churchill stood between two victories that could not share the same spotlight. The river was behind them. The reckoning between allies was moving closer. Montgomery's case against Patton was presented in the careful tone of a man who understood that anger, unshaped, is easily dismissed. He did not speak as if he had been offended. He spoke as if the alliance had been endangered. Patton's behavior, he argued, was destabilizing, undisciplined, boastful, corrosive to coalition order at the very moment unity mattered most. The Rhine had not only been crossed, Montgomery implied, a boundary of acceptable conduct had been crossed with it. If the war was a machine built from multiple nations, then one commander's hunger for attention could jam the gears. He framed the matter as principle because principle sounds impartial even when it carries a personal wound. Operations must be coordinated, he insisted. Announcements must be controlled. Commanders must not freelance in ways that force allies into reaction. In late March 1945, this argument had genuine weight. The Western Allies were moving across a collapsing Germany, their supply lines stretched, their objectives still governed by political agreements as much as tactical opportunities. A sudden, unilateral move could create gaps, misunderstandings, and duplication of effort. Montgomery's language pointed toward that danger and made it seem urgent, almost obvious. Discipline was not etiquette, it was survival. But inside the British headquarters, the argument did not remain abstract for long. Staff officers began drafting language that transformed irritation into an official complaint. It was a quiet, methodical process. Phrases were tested, softened, sharpened, then tested again. The words had to be firm enough to matter, but restrained enough to avoid appearing petty. In coalition war, the first casualty of an ill-judged memo is trust. So the drafting became its own kind of battle, one fought with clauses and implications, with the careful placement of responsibility. The complaint was shaped to sound like stewardship. Yet the hidden motive sat beneath the text like a second document no one could admit existed. Discipline here was becoming a way to reclaim narrative ownership. If Patton's action could be reframed as misconduct, then Montgomery's moment could be restored, at least partially, by suggesting that the first crossing had been improper, premature, even selfish. The story would become less Patton beat Montgomery and more Patton disrupted Allied order. In the politics of memory, that distinction mattered. It could turn humiliation into vindication without a shot fired. On the American side, Patton's camp sensed the shift almost immediately. The radio still carried operational updates, but the tone of messages from above began to feel colder, more deliberate. Success had made enemies. This was an old lesson in war, and Patton's staff understood it even if Patton pretended not to care. Men who win visibly create men who feel diminished, and diminished men seek mechanisms of restraint that look like justice. They want correction, not because correction improves the war effort, but because correction restores balance in the story. Patton's officers began to watch the channels of authority as carefully as they watched the roads east. They understood that the weapon being turned against them was not German artillery, but coalition politics. A reprimand could slow their tempo. A public rebuke could shift supply priorities. A forced lesson in discipline could become an invisible leash tightened at the very moment Patton believed the war should be accelerated. The cruel paradox of coalition fighting was now fully visible. The better you did, the more dangerous your success could become, because it changed the internal balance of esteem. And this was the moment the argument reached Churchill in its most consequential form. Churchill listened and understood what Montgomery was truly asking for. Not simply a private complaint, not simply an adjustment in press procedure. Montgomery wanted consequences that would be seen. He wanted Patton checked in a way that restored the hierarchy of legitimacy. And for Churchill, the danger of that request was immediate and severe. Patton, whatever his flaws, had become an American symbol, aggression made flesh, the embodiment of the U.S. Army's restless force. To publicly humiliate him would not look like mature coalition discipline. It would look like Britain striking at America's most vivid representative of success. In 1945, symbols were not decorative. They were structural. The alliance held together because each nation felt respected inside it. If Churchill allowed Montgomery to punish Patton in public, he risked sending a message to Washington that Britain resented American achievement and wanted to police it. The result would not be obedience. It would be resentment, suspicion, and the kind of friction that slows armies even when orders still move. Germany might be collapsing, but the war could still bleed time, and time still killed. Yet Churchill also understood the opposite risk. If he dismissed Montgomery too bluntly, He would break something British at the moment Britain needed cohesion. The belief that its contribution still mattered, that its commanders were not merely watching America finish the war. Montgomery's pride was tied to national pride, and Churchill, politician and patriot, could not ignore that connection. He could not simply tell Montgomery to accept being upstaged, not without consequences of his own at home and within his own command structure. So the turning point arrived in a form that was quieter than the crossing itself. Churchill had to answer Montgomery without breaking him, and he had to protect Patton without endorsing Patton's ego. He needed a reply that preserved unity, preserved momentum, and preserved Britain's dignity, all at once. And in that narrowing corridor of choices, Churchill was about to do what he did best: turn a political crisis into a sentence that redirected the entire room. Churchill did not reject Montgomery's demand because he found Patton admirable. He rejected it because he found the war unforgiving. By March 1945, victory had become the only currency the Allies could still spend, and it was being spent at a furious rate. Armies were advancing faster than staffs could comfortably coordinate. German units were retreating, surrendering, or collapsing into fragments that still killed when cornered. In that environment, Churchill understood a simple truth. You do not punish momentum while the enemy is still alive. You protect it, even when it arrives in an inconvenient shape. He shifted the argument away from personalities and toward consequence. This was not the moment, he implied, to litigate credit. The enemy was in retreat. The interior of Germany lay open. The war's end depended not on etiquette, but on pressure. To pause now, to slow, to discipline, to publicly rebuke, would be to spend time the Allies no longer needed to waste. The Rhine had been crossed. The question was not who crossed first, but how quickly the crossing could be turned into a flood. And floods do not advance on schedule, they advance by force. Those who heard Churchill in this moment later remarked on a subtle change in his voice. The familiar warmth remained, the rhetorical ease, the capacity to acknowledge pride without endorsing it, but beneath it ran steel. This was the voice that could charm Parliament and also bend it. He was not angry. He was resolved. The war had narrowed the range of acceptable decisions, and Churchill intended to stay within it. He did not excuse Patton's abrasiveness. He simply refused to treat abrasiveness as a crime when it had delivered tangible advantage. Without naming the fear directly, Churchill implied what Montgomery did not want to hear. The alliance needed Patton's aggression. Not forever. Not without limits. But now, at this stage, on this ground, it needed exactly the quality that Patton embodied. The American general's rough edges were part of the same instrument that was shattering German resistance. To blunt that instrument for reasons of pride would not be discipline, it would be indulgence. And indulgence, Churchill believed, was a luxury paid for in blood. Here lay the quiet exchange that would never be fully recorded. Churchill was making a trade, and he knew it. He was trading British spotlight for Allied velocity. He was accepting that Britain's meticulously prepared moment would be shared, or even overshadowed, by American audacity, because velocity ends wars. Spotlight does not. Prestige does not. Speeches do not. What ends wars is the enemy's inability to recover, and Patton's kind of pressure made recovery impossible. Churchill had spent years urging faster action from reluctant allies. He would not now punish speed because it embarrassed him. He also understood the signal such punishment would send beyond the room. To Germany, a public Allied dispute would advertise weakness, a hint that unity was thinning just as defeat approached. Dictatorships watch alliances closely. They survive by exploiting fractures. Churchill had seen that movie before. To America, a reprimand of Patton would look like mistrust, even envy. It would suggest that British pride mattered more than Allied success. And mistrust, once planted, does not stay contained within a single issue. It spreads, slows coordination, and corrodes goodwill at precisely the moment the post-war world was beginning to take shape. Churchill did not say these things bluntly. He did not need to. He let the implications do the work. He made it clear that internal examples, public lessons meant to restore balance, were dangerous tools. They create the illusion of order while quietly weakening resolve. The war was not yet finished. Men were still dying. Cities were still burning. This was not the hour for symbolic discipline. It was the hour for finishing the task. In doing so, Churchill also protected Montgomery, though not in the way Montgomery wanted. He did not dismiss Montgomery's competence or belittle his method. He acknowledged, implicitly, that set pieces had their place, that order, when it delivered results, was invaluable. But he refused to allow method to claim ownership of victory. Victory belonged to the alliance, not to a timetable. And the alliance, at that moment, was being carried forward by speed. The deeper message sat beneath everything Churchill said and did not say. Prestige matters. It always has. Nations fight for dignity as well as survival. But prestige that interrupts momentum becomes a liability. It tempts leaders to treat victory as a possession rather than a process. Churchill had spent his life watching wars won and squandered in the aftermath by men who could not separate pride from purpose. He would not repeat that mistake in the war that defined him. And so his reply closed the matter without resolving the resentment. Patton would not be punished, not because he was right in all things, but because he was right where it mattered most. Montgomery would not be publicly vindicated, not because he was wrong, but because vindication would slow the war. Prestige would be acknowledged later. Momentum had to be protected now. In that decision lay Churchill's quiet command of the alliance. Victory first, accounting later. The war was still moving, and he intended to keep it that way. Some sentences survive because they are eloquent. Others survive because they are accurate. Churchill's remark about Montgomery belonged to the second category, a line remembered not for flourish, but for the way it named a human truth inside a military coalition. When Churchill chose to speak, he did not deliver a speech. He delivered a diagnosis. Montgomery, he suggested, was formidable in defeat and unbearable in victory. The words carried a faint humor on their surface, but their function was surgical. They described a temperament that could withstand pressure, endure criticism, and tighten into discipline when circumstances were grim, yet become insistent, proprietary, even suffocating when success arrived and demanded an audience. The moment did not explode. It did not need to. The power of the remark was its calmness. In the room, among staff officers, aides, and men trained to measure consequences in seconds, the words landed softly and still rearranged everything. It was the kind of shift you can feel more than hear, like a map being turned slightly and making all the arrows point somewhere new. No one needed Churchill to repeat himself. The caution was understood. The remark was not merely commentary on Montgomery. It was a warning about what pride does when it is given a microphone. In that single sentence, Churchill drew a boundary. He was telling Montgomery, without open confrontation, to stop treating the alliance like an audience. Coalition war is not an auditorium where one general receives applause while others stand in the wings. It is a machine built from competing nations, competing egos, and shared danger. The machine functions only when men accept that they will not always be the hero of the frame. Churchill was reminding Montgomery, quietly but unmistakably, that victory did not grant ownership of the story. Britain could demand respect, but it could not demand that reality conform to a script. And yet the line cut both ways. Even as it checked Montgomery, it also contained a warning aimed in Patton's direction, though Patton was not necessarily present to hear it. Churchill's message was that boldness was admired, even necessary, but ego would be managed. Patton's speed was valuable, his aggression useful, his willingness to seize opportunities decisive. But the coalition would not allow any one man to turn success into personal license. Patton might be protected from punitive politics, but he was not being crowned. Churchill was reminding everyone in the room that the war did not belong to the loudest personality. This was the deeper revelation. Great coalitions survive by disciplining pride, not by outlawing it. Pride cannot be abolished. It is part of what drives men to endure strain, to demand excellence, to refuse defeat. But pride must be guided, shaped, and occasionally humbled, because unrestrained pride seeks dominance, and dominance is poison to unity. Churchill, who had spent decades navigating rivalries within cabinets and empires, understood that the same rule applied to generals. You do not crush a strong ego, you fence it in, you give it a task and deny it a throne. So the complaint dissolved, not into friendship, but into necessity. Montgomery was not converted, Patton was not reformed. They remained what they were, two men representing two national moods and two operational philosophies. But the war was too close to ending for vanity to delay it. Germany was collapsing in sections, towns were surrendering, pockets of resistance still fought with desperation. Every day the front advanced was a day closer to the end of killing. That reality imposed its own discipline. It made arguments over credit feel smaller, even when pride insisted otherwise. Churchill's sentence did something else too. It restored proportion. It reminded the room that no single crossing, no matter how photographed, was the war. The war was the sum of 1,000 such moments, and the only moral claim any commander could make was that he had helped end it sooner rather than later. In that light, being first was not the point. Finishing was. The climax, then, was quiet. There was no firing, no public reprimand, no dramatic dismissal, only a sentence, delivered with Churchill's practiced restraint, that reasserted what mattered most. The alliance would not be broken by competing headlines. It would not pause to perform moral theatre for the press. It would keep moving. And yet the room did not relax. A boundary had been drawn, but boundaries do not erase resentment. They only contain it. Montgomery would remember the humiliation. Patton would continue to test limits. Churchill had prevented a rupture, but he had not created harmony. He had chosen the only workable option in late March 1945, hold the coalition together long enough to finish the enemy, even if the men inside it never truly liked one another. Because beyond the river, beyond the sentences, the war was accelerating, and the next question was not what Churchill said, but what his choice would cost once the shooting stopped. After the Rhine, the Western Front stopped looking like a line and began looking like a flood. Once the last great river barrier was breached in multiple places, Germany's defences did not collapse in a single dramatic fall. They collapsed in sections. Here a town surrendering without a shot, there an SS pocket fighting until its ammunition ran out, elsewhere a column of prisoners trudging west while artillery still rumbled in the distance. The Reich had been built on the promise of permanence. Now it was dissolving into a patchwork of ruins and retreat orders. Roads filled with refugees and military traffic, and the air carried the mingled smells of spring and burning fuel. The war was ending, but it was ending violently, unevenly, and faster than many men dared to believe. Patton thrived in this kind of ending. With his Third Army already across, he kept driving, still hungry, still reading the map like a challenge, still treating delay as the only real enemy. His columns pressed eastward through central Germany, chasing crossings, junctions, and surrendering units with the same relentless rhythm that had carried them across France the previous summer. To Patton, the Rhine had not been a finale. It had been a door, and once the door was open, he intended to run through it before anyone could decide it should close again. But speed at this stage came with a leash, and Patton could feel it even when he pretended not to. Higher headquarters worried about overextension, about supply lines that stretched thin, about political boundaries and meeting lines agreed between commanders. Patton tested those limits as naturally as he tested enemy defences. Every success tempted him to press harder, to turn operational advantage into strategic reach. He believed he could take more if he was allowed to move. Others feared he would take too much and force the coalition into decisions it had not planned to make. In late March and April 1945, the enemy was retreating, but coalition control remained cautious because even victory had politics. Farther north, Montgomery executed his own crossing, massive, methodical, and in purely military terms, highly effective. The bridges went in. The assault waves followed. The Germans were overwhelmed by coordinated firepower and careful sequencing. Yet the public mind, already shaped by the earlier headline, began to absorb it differently. In one quiet moment, Montgomery watched the news coverage shift and felt the war leaving him behind, not on the ground, but in the story. His method produced results, but it did not produce surprise. It did not produce that intoxicating sense of being first. And in a world that remembered events through photographs and slogans, being second could feel like being unseen. Churchill watched all of this with the wary patience of a leader who knew that even triumph could be unstable. At home, Britain needed reassurance that its years of sacrifice had not ended in a supporting role. On the continent, the alliance needed calm, because calm kept supply systems working and prevented needless friction. So Churchill rationed praise the way governments ration scarce goods, carefully, strategically, with an eye to what each portion would accomplish. He praised British professionalism without publicly diminishing American drive. He protected unity without pretending that unity was effortless. He understood that in coalition war, morale is not maintained by truth alone, but by the careful ordering of truth. And as victory drew closer, another revelation became impossible to ignore. The closer the end comes, the more fiercely men fight over how it will be remembered. In the long middle years of the war, survival had been the obsession. In 1945, survival was becoming assured, and memory rushed in to fill the space. Commanders began to sense that the shooting would stop, but the judgment would not. History would weigh them not only by what they did, but by what the public believed they did. And belief, in modern war, was shaped as much by timing and narrative as by maps and casualty lists. The Rhine crossing itself became a symbol, an emblem of two philosophies. On one side stood orchestration, the set-piece assault, engineered and controlled, meant to demonstrate competence and command. On the other stood improvisation, the sudden crossing, the refusal to wait, the seizure of advantage before the enemy could adjust. Both methods worked, both carried costs. But in the public imagination, improvisation had outshone orchestration. It made better headlines. It felt like destiny being forced open by will. That symbolic imbalance hardened reputations. Patton became, even more than before, the face of American momentum, brilliant, abrasive, and difficult to contain. Montgomery became, even more than before, the face of British control, competent, disciplined, and fiercely protective of credit. Churchill became the hinge between them, praised for holding the coalition together and criticized for every perceived slight to national pride. These reputations were not merely personal, they were political artifacts, carried into the post-war years like medals that sometimes cut the skin. And that was the cost that lingered after the Rhine. The war accelerated, but the rivalry did not disappear. It only lost its immediate battlefield and began to settle into memory. Edges hardened, resentments fossilized, and when the guns finally went quiet, those hardened edges would still be there, shaping how the victory was told, and who was allowed to own it. Churchill's refusal to punish Patton can be described as diplomacy, or as indulgence, or as the weary tolerance of a statesman dealing with difficult men. But in truth, it was strategy, hard, practical, and shaped by the brutal mathematics of war's final weeks. Punishing Patton would not merely have satisfied Montgomery's demand for order, it would have slowed the advance. It would have inserted hesitation into a campaign that was winning precisely because it did not hesitate. And it would have weakened the alliance's heart at the moment that heart needed to beat strongest. Not in celebration, but in continuation, in the relentless movement that forces an enemy's collapse to become irreversible. By spring 1945, Germany's defeat was no longer in doubt, but the manner of its defeat still mattered. Every additional week of war meant more civilians displaced, More cities shattered, more prisoners marched and shot in the confusion of retreat. Momentum was not a luxury, it was a form of protection. Churchill understood that, and so he treated unity as a weapon, one that could not be allowed to rust from inside through petty vindications. If an Allied general was publicly disciplined for the crime of being first, then every other commander would learn the wrong lesson, that success carried political risk, and that caution might be safer than initiative. Wars are not won by teaching men to fear their own victories. Later, away from headquarters rooms and the heat of arguments, Churchill could be alone with the weight of what leadership demanded. There is a particular solitude to command at the highest level. You speak in confident phrases in front of others, and then you sit in quiet rooms and feel the cost of the confidence you must display. In a small, private micro-moment, perhaps late at night, perhaps with papers spread out and the day's noise faded, Churchill would have known what many leaders learn too late. Leadership often means swallowing the satisfaction of being right. It means enduring the discomfort of unresolved grievance so that larger forces can keep moving. This is where the moral psychology becomes unavoidable. Men who command armies still crave applause. They may speak of duty and sacrifice, and they are not lying, but they also need their suffering to be witnessed. Applause is proof that the strain, the sleeplessness, the responsibility for thousands of lives meant something in the eyes of others. That hunger does not disappear simply because a man wears a uniform. In some cases, it becomes stronger, because the moral stakes feel higher. If the war has taken years of your life, if it has hardened your decisions and narrowed your humanity, then you want history to say it was worth it. Montgomery's hunger for recognition was not childish, it was human. He had built his identity on competence, on order, on the belief that disciplined methods saved lives and preserved strength. He could point to successes that validated him. Yet his flaw was that he could confuse methodical competence with entitlement to ownership. He did not merely want the war to be won, he wanted the war to look, in its winning, like his method had been the essential instrument. When Patton crossed early and the world was told, Montgomery felt not only upstaged, but robbed, because the story did not conform to the logic he believed should govern it. Patton's hunger was equally human and equally dangerous. He believed speed saved lives, and often he was right. He understood that crushing an enemy's ability to reorganize could shorten suffering. Yet his flaw was that he could confuse speed with moral authority. Because his advances produced dramatic results, he sometimes treated those results as permission. Not merely permission to push faster, but permission to disregard the restraints that coalition warfare required. Patton could begin to believe that momentum justified everything, including the public performance of his own triumph. He did not always distinguish between doing what was effective and doing what was wise. Churchill stood between these two flaws, and his genius, if it can be called that, was to understand the difference between justice and usefulness in wartime. He did not deny the legitimacy of Montgomery's irritation. He did not deny the necessity of restraining Patton's ego. But he refused to let the alliance treat credit as a moral prize to be awarded to the most deserving. Because in coalition war, credit is not simply a reward. It is a resource. It must be distributed, balanced, and managed so the machine keeps running. Give too much to one side and the other feels humiliated. Give too little and initiative dies. Churchill knew that if the coalition began to tear itself apart over recognition, then the enemy, even in retreat, would gain time, and time would claim lives. So he chose unity over vindication, not because vindication was unimportant, but because vindication could wait. The war could not. And in that choice lies the lesson that outlasts the personalities. Churchill protected victory by refusing to let victory become a private possession. He treated success as common property, because only common property could keep the alliance moving. And yet the most difficult truths rarely end cleanly. The resentment remained, contained but not dissolved, waiting for the moment when the guns fell silent and men began fighting with words for the ownership of what they had survived. We returned to the Rhine as Churchill saw it, through cold wind, camera shutters, and the thin metallic smell that lingers where armies have been working for weeks. By now, the river was no longer a single dramatic obstacle. It was a corridor of crossings, pontoons, ferries, temporary bridges humming under the weight of trucks and artillery, the constant churn of movement east. The war was ending, but it was ending in fragments. Columns of prisoners moved west with blank faces. White flags appeared on village streets, then disappeared in the next town where someone still chose to fight. The soundscape of March and April 1945 was not triumphal music. It was engines, distant gunfire, and the occasional sharp burst that reminded everyone that defeat can still kill. Churchill stood amid this machinery of conclusion with the instinct that had carried him through darker years, the instinct to translate events into meaning without letting meaning distort the event itself. Cameras wanted a moment. Correspondents wanted a clean narrative. Headquarters staff wanted order. But the truth on the Rhine was messier. The crossing that had been planned as Britain's proof of disciplined command had become, in the public memory, something else, an episode remembered first for American audacity. That was the irony that hung over the river like smoke. The set piece meant to glorify orchestration would always be haunted by improvisation. And yet, in the mud and cold, that irony did not belong to the men who mattered most. On the east bank, among the troops who had actually crossed, a soldier could be found crouched beside a kit bag, rubbing his hands against the chill, watching the flow of vehicles and prisoners. He did not care who owned the headline. He cared that the war was finally leaving his body, the constant tension in the shoulders, the reflex to flinch at sudden sound, the exhaustion that settled into the bones. For him, the Rhine was not theatre, it was threshold. It was the place where the possibility of going home began to feel real. This is what Churchill understood, and what made his earlier reply more than a clever remark. It became an act of coalition command. Restrain pride, preserve motion, finish the enemy. It was not romantic, and it was not satisfying to every ego in the alliance. But it was the only logic that matched the stakes. Churchill knew that if the Allies began to punish one another for winning, they would teach themselves hesitation. They would turn victory into litigation. And litigation in wartime is a slow poison. It delays decisions. It creates factions. It gives the enemy, still armed, still dangerous, what he wants most: time. So Churchill did what coalition leaders must do when great men begin to compete with each other's shadows. He did not deny pride. He redirected it. He allowed Montgomery to remain respected without allowing Montgomery to own the story. He allowed Patton to remain unleashed enough to be useful without allowing Patton to become untouchable. In other words, he treated their talents like tools, valuable, dangerous, and requiring control, not like sacred expressions of national destiny. Montgomery remained a great commander. His method had saved lives and produced results. His attention to preparation and his insistence on overwhelming force were not weaknesses. They were responses to Britain's reality and to the lessons of earlier slaughter. But the Rhine episode taught a quiet, bitter truth. Greatness does not grant ownership of the story. In coalition war, even a brilliant operation can be remembered through someone else's timing. The public does not always reward competence. It rewards drama, sequence, and first impressions. Montgomery could command armies. He could not command memory. Patton also remained what he always had been, a great fighter, a ruthless engine of advance. His speed helped shatter Germany's ability to recover, and his insistence on momentum carried real strategic value in the war's final weeks. But the same episode hinted at a lesson he never fully welcomed. Victory does not grant immunity from consequence. A coalition can tolerate rough edges, but it cannot tolerate a man who believes triumph cancels discipline. Patton's hunger made him effective. It also made him vulnerable to resentment, to political containment, and to the inevitable moment when higher command would decide that speed must be balanced against control. And Churchill, standing by the Rhine with the cameras clicking and the war dissolving into surrender, understood the quiet irony at the center of it all. The greatest danger to a winning coalition is not defeat, but pride. Pride turns shared effort into private property. It turns allies into rivals. It makes men forget that the purpose of war is not to be remembered well, but to end the killing. So the final meaning of the episode was not a quarrel over headlines. It was a demonstration of how fragile victory can be when it becomes a contest of ego. Churchill's sentence did not erase rivalry, but it contained it long enough for the armies to keep moving east, long enough for Germany's collapse to become final, long enough for more soldiers to live to see peace. Montgomery wanted a firing, Churchill chose a sentence, and the war kept moving.